as an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, I don't dig in the ground unless I'm gardening. Uh, but I do study the life ways and culture and history of contemporary populations. And people often say, well, what are the human universals? What is it that all cultures have in common? And there's some very broad kinds of things that are in common with all cultures. One of them is classification. All human cultures classify everything, the world around them, what they can see and so on. So it's not unusual that people have classified and divided up the Pacific in different ways. We have some idea of how the Pacific Islanders saw their world. They didn't see their world as islands. They saw their worlds as destinations, which you might say, well, what does that mean? There was a famous navigator, priest, really, wise person, university lecturer, whatever you want to call him, but he was a very important man in Tahitian society. And Cook met him on his first voyage to the Pacific in 1769. Cook was very impressed by this man who was called Tupaia. And Tupaia knew the names of over 5,000 destinations in the Pacific. Not islands, but places you could go to. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the stick charts that are still around in some parts of the Pacific. They're a series of sticks arranged with seashells marking the different destinations. And actually, these are what people take with them in the canoe, but when the master navigator is laying them out, he does it in the sand. And people have to remember. It's not like our culture. Our culture writes things down. Asian, European culture writes things down. So the Pacific Islanders saw their land as a series of destinations. Europeans who came to the Pacific from, I think, about 1512, might be a little bit different, the date. But around that time, a Spaniard called Vasco Núñez de Balboa, great name, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama and walked into what we now call the Pacific Ocean. Did you know that Taiwan was originally claimed by the Spanish? That Japan was claimed by the Spanish? Australia was claimed by the Spanish, because what Balboa did in his arrogance and, of course, his ignorance is when he stepped into the Pacific, just on the shore there at Panama, he said that he claimed for Spain the whole of this body of water and every land on which it touched. That's extraordinary, because he had no idea what he was dealing with. But he made those claims. Of course, they've never been enforced. But people, after a while, divided the Pacific in terms of islands. That's what Europeans saw. They didn't see destinations. They saw islands. And, of course, when you arrived to an island, a European would say, well, what's the name of this island? Sometimes the people would say, well, the name of the island is Sand. They didn't have a name. The name of the island is Green. They didn't have a name. So Europeans took those names and wrote them down as the names of islands, the names that didn't exist before. I can give you an example, again from the 18th century, but there are other examples, just one will do. Cook was on an island in the Cook group. It's named for him. He didn't name it, but it's named for him. An island called Aitutaki. And he pointed down south, and he said, what's down there? He didn't know. He hadn't been there. And the people of Aitutaki said, quite truthfully, the south wind. that's where the south wind comes from. And that in their language is Rarotonga. So Cook sailed south, found an island, and called it Rarotonga, without realizing that it was the name of the wind, not the name of the island. The island didn't have a name. So progressively over time, Europeans named all the islands of the Pacific. And there are probably between 15,000 and 16,000 islands in the Pacific. It's a lot of islands. They've all got a name. It was a French geographer, a man called Sébastien Dumont d'Urville. Oh, beautiful. He was a nobleman. And he'd sailed with, he was familiar with La Perouse. He'd done some sailing himself, but he was very interested in geography. So he decided to organize the Pacific. So he divided the Pacific into 4 places. This was in 1817, I think. And did maps. He was a good map maker as well. And he was wealthy, so he could afford to publish them. If no one else wanted to, he could lay out the money. He was very well off. And his division of the Pacific was Polynesia, like we know today, because there were many islands. That's all it means, many islands. Micronesia, because he thought, and he'd never been to them, but he thought the islands were smaller than other parts of the Pacific. It's not true, but he thought that, so that's good enough. Melanesia. Melanesia were the dark islands. Well, it wasn't that the islands were dark, it's the people were dark. But he wanted to keep up this Nesia idea. Nesia is from the Greek for island. So, dark island, many islands, Micronesia, small islands. Now I said he divided it into 4. The 4th one was Melanesia. And that's what we call today the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But that part didn't stick. Even on French maps, you don't find Melanesia. About the middle of the 19th century, nobody cared about that 4th division. It was just left aside. Well, a lot of people have said that this division is a false one. Many islands. There are many islands in the Pacific. Why should one place be called many islands? Doesn't make sense. Even though we're familiar with it now. We say Polynesia. We all know. If I say to you Polynesia, you'll have an image in your mind immediately. It's been around for 100 or nearly 200 years now. Melanesia, well, you might have an image in your mind, you might not. Micronesia, people aren't too certain even where a lot of people where Micronesia is. Now, the main dispute since the 1980s has been between people who say the division between Polynesia and Melanesia is a false one, that there's a lot of overlap, that there are dark people living in Polynesia and light-skinned people living in Melanesia, and anyhow it's racist, and we shouldn't use that anymore. So that's been the main dispute between Polynesia and Melanesia. The debates have sort of left Micronesia out. They haven't really considered the problem. They haven't taken it seriously. Well, that may be so, and those debates are important ones. But I think the main division in the Pacific today is not the division proposed by Dumont d'Urville.
I would argue that the real division of the Pacific, one that is very difficult to argue against, is in fact another kind of Nesia. Nesia is from the Greek word for island. And I'm going to talk about them. They're in the paper, you can read. I want to start with Hispanonesia, the place where Spanish is spoken in the Pacific. And speaking a language is a barrier. If you don't speak Spanish, you can't read what's happening in this part of the world. You can't read the newspapers from there. You can't hear the radio programs. You can't see the television. And you can't read a lot of the research either. Hispanonesia, and that's the part of the world where I work. And another part of the world, another division, Franconesia, where French is the metropolitan language. Now notice when I'm putting these up, I'm ignoring the 12 to 1500 indigenous languages. I'm talking about the metropolitan languages that have been imposed on these places. Anglonesia has captured a lot more of the Pacific. You can see why I'm not a geographer. That's the only way I can think of to draw this map. But Anglonesia is where English is spoken as the metropolitan language. And Malayanesia, why not? Because the Malay language is spoken in that part of the Pacific on the left-hand side, and it is, again, the language of instruction, the language of education. And, of course, Nipponesia, and we are, in fact, you probably didn't even know that you lived in Anesia of the Pacific, but you live in Sinonesia. Now, what is the effect of all of this? It means that the Pacific is divided by language. It means that people who have their education here in Hispanonesia, they can't take that education. It's not portable to another language part of the Pacific. Similarly, people who have their instruction in Anglonesia, they can't take their instruction, their qualifications, they can't take those to another place. So these are really strong barriers, and I argue that these are the barriers that divide the Pacific today. But there's hope yet. The hope is meetings of this kind. There are several Nesias represented here. Franconesia, my colleague here, but he's lived in Sinonesia for many years. I come from Anglonesia, but I'm familiar with Hispanonesia, and there may even be some people here from the other Nesias, including Nipponesia, where Japanese is spoken. So what we are not these ocean currents, but I would argue that what we are, we delegates to a conference of this sort, we are like this Möbius strip. We can take our knowledge, we can go back to our Nesias, we can spread that knowledge. You are all carriers. You're all on the Möbius strip of knowledge. Thank you.